Hey, what's going on, developers? This is Sakura channel and I'm back with a new tutorial for you. Today we are going to use Drizzle ORM in a NestJS project. You can also use this tutorial as a crash course for learning Drizzle ORM. It means that you don't need to have any prior knowledge about Drizzle ORM. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to get started with Drizzle ORM. And also, as I said, we're going to integrate the Drizzle ORM in a NestJS project. You just need to have some basic understanding of NestJS framework, nothing advanced, just basic concept like modules, services, and controllers. That's it. All right, let me show you the topics that we are going to cover in this video. First, we are going to implement this schema with Drizzle ORM. As you can see, it has 6 tables inside it, and it contains all types of the relationships. It has one-to-one, one-to-many, and also many-to-many relationships. And these are the topics that you are going to learn in this video. First, we are going to integrate the Drizzle ORM in our NestJS project, and then we are going to create the tables with Drizzle ORM, generate and run migrations, define the relationships between the tables. As I said, we're going to implement a one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many relationships in this video. We're going to define composite primary keys. Also, we're going to define the indexes. And of course, we're going to see how we can seed our database with some testing data. And at the last section, we are going to do CRUD operations with this schema with the Drizzle ORM client. All right, with these topics in mind, let's start our tutorial. All right, so let's do everything from scratch and create a brand new NestJS project real quick. You should have installed the NestJS CLI. After installing that, I'm going to create a new project, nest new, and then I'm going to call it Drizzle. Okay, so now let's open up the project. And in the first step, we need to install the dependencies. So again, I open up the terminal and here I'm going to say npm I Drizzle ORM. And since we are going to use Postgres, I'm going to install PG. All right, now let's install the dev dependencies, npm I-d drizzle kit. We're going to use that for running the migrations and also add types /pg. All right, the dependencies are installed. And now we're going to create a new NestJS module for Drizzle ORM. So here I'm going to use NestCLI for doing that, NestGMO, which stands for module, and I'm going to call it Drizzle. Okay, now as you can see here in the src directory, we have a Drizzle directory and inside it we have a Drizzle module. In this module, we're going to create a Drizzle service, and then we can use this Drizzle service in other services in order to have access to the API of Drizzle ORM. So let's open the Drizzle module, and here inside it, we need to create a dynamic provider, which finally creates and export an instance of Drizzle DB. And then we can import that instance of Drizzle DB in other services to do CRUD operation with our Drizzle DB. But before doing that, we need to create our Postgres database. So for creating the database, I'm going to use Neon, which is a really easy to use cloud provider for creating Postgres databases. You just need to sign in the Neon console, and then it redirects you to the create project page. And inside this page, we just need to specify a project name and also a name for our database. So for the project name, I'm going to go ahead with the Drizzle Nest. And for the database name, I'm going to put something like Drizzle DB. All right. And now we just need to click on the create project. And then here in the Postgres section, this is the URL of our database. So just need to copy the snippet here and get back to our NestJS project. And then we just need to create a database URL variable and just paste the URL that we've just copied from the Neon console. All right, let's save this. And now in order to access to the Env variables, we need to install the nestjs/config. So here, I'm going to say npm I at nestjs/config. If we don't install this package, we cannot access to our Env variables throughout our NestJS application. All right, so now get back to our Drizzle module. And here now we can create our dynamic provider. So let's close this off. And here in the module decorator, we're going to specify the providers. And inside it, we're going to pass an object for creating the dynamic provider. First, we need to specify the provide property. Actually, here we need to set a unique token for this provider. And then when we are going to inject this provider in other services, we need to provide the token that we specified here. So for doing a unique token, I'm going to create a symbol here. So here I'm going to export a constant. I'm going to call it Drizzle, and we're going to set it to symbol, and then inside it we need to pass a description for this symbol. I'm going to call it Drizzle connection. All right, with using the symbol here, we make sure that this Drizzle constant is a unique value throughout our NestJS application. So here we just pass the Drizzle symbol that we have just created to the provide property of our provider. Then we need to inject the config service to this provider because we need to use config service in order to get the database URL Env variable. So in the inject list, we're going to pass the config service. As you can see, it comes from the NestJS/config. All right, now we're going to create a factory function which creates an instance of our Drizzle DB. So here we're going to use factory here, and we're going to set it to an async function. It takes the config service. So I'm going to specify a parameter named config service and set its type to the config service class that we have just imported from the NestJS/config. And also make sure that you inject the config service in the inject section of this provider. Otherwise, we will get a runtime error. All right. And then in the body of this factory function, first we need to get the database URL. So here I'm going to say const database URL, and then use the config service to get the value from our env file. So here I'm going to use config service, the get function, and specify the type of the env variable, which is string, and then specify the name of our variable inside the env file. So it is database URL. So just copy that, get back to our Drizzle module and paste it here. All right. Now we can create a connection pool with this database URL. So here I'm going to say const pool and set it to new pool class, which comes from the PG package. So let's import that. And inside the constructor, we need to pass a configuration object. We need to set the connection string to the database URL that we've just get from our config service, and then set the SSL to true. All right. So now we have created a Postgres connection pool, and now we can create a Drizzle instance with the Drizzle function from Drizzle ORM package. So here I'm going to use Drizzle function, which comes from the Drizzle ORM/node Postgres. And then here we're going to pass the pool that we have created here to this Drizzle function. And also we need to pass an object, and inside it we need to pass the schema of Drizzle ORM. So we haven't created a schema for our Drizzle ORM. So let's just create a schema for Drizzle inside the Drizzle module. I'm going to create a schema.ts. For now, let's just keep this file empty. Later in this video, we're going to define our table in this file. But for now, as I said, let's just keep it empty and get back to our Drizzle module. Here in the Drizzle function, we need to import everything from schema. So here I'm going to say import everything as schema from the schema file that we have just created. All right. Now let's get back to our Drizzle function and pass the schema here. So now this Drizzle function create an instance of the Drizzle DB client. So we need to return that. So here, just use the return before it, and let's set a typecasting for this object. I'm going to cast it as node PG database, and then inside the generics, we're going to set the type of the schema. And this node PG database is coming from the Drizzle ORM/node Postgres. And as a last step, we need to export this provider from this module. So here, after the providers list, we're going to have an export list, and inside it, we just need to specify the token that we set to this provider. So just use Drizzle constant here. Now we can inject this provider in other services to do CRUD operation with our Drizzle ORM. Now in the next section of this video, we're going to focus on creating the tables of our database in the schema file that we have just created here. And by the way, this error that we have here in importing this schema is because of the schema file is empty. We didn't export anything from this module, and as soon as I create the tables in this schema file, this error will be gone. Right? So let's get back to the database diagram. Here, let's create our user table in our Drizzle ORM schema file. Get back to VS Code. I open up the schema file, and here let's create the user table. So here I'm going to say export const users and set it to PG table function that comes from the Drizzle ORM/PG core. In the first parameter, we need to specify a name for our table in our physical database. So I just go ahead with the users, and now we need to pass a config object in which we are going to define the fields of our table. The first one is going to be ID. We're going to set its type to serial. Again, make sure to import it from the PG core. not MySQL core. And in the first parameter, we need to set the name of the field inside our physical database. Just go ahead with the ID, and then we can set it as primary key. So I just chain the primary key function here. Now it's an auto increment ID field inside our database, which will be set as the primary key of the table. Right now, let's create the next field. It is going to be name, and set it to text function, which comes from the Drizzle ORM/PG core. Specify the name of the field, which is going to be just name. And we can also put a constraint for this field. For example, chain the not null function. All right, let's go for the next field, email, and set it to text function again. Specify its name, just email, and again set chain the not null function. And now let's just define the last field, which is the password. And again, it's a text field. Specify the name inside our database and chain the not null function. And also we can use the default function here to specify a default value for this function. All right, so we don't need that. I just put it as not null. And this is the first table in our database. And now before creating the other tables and relationship between our tables, let's push this table into our Postgres database. And for doing that, we need to create a migration and then push it to our database. For doing that, we're going to use Drizzle Kit package. We have already installed that package. We just need to configure the Drizzle Kit. So here in the root path of our NestJS project, we're going to create a drizzle.config.ts file. So here we're going to create a drizzle.config.ts. And inside it, I'm going to say export default and then call define config function of the Drizzle kit. We can't just import that automatically, so just manually import it from the Drizzle kit, and then we can use this function here. We're going to pass in config object, and inside it, we're going to specify the path of our schema file. So here, we're going to say it is inside the src directory, and then Drizzle, and then inside it, we have the schema.ts file. And then we're going to specify the dialect. We're going to set it to Postgres because our database is a Postgres database. And then we're going to specify the DB credential. I'm going to set it to an object, and inside it, we just need to specify the URL of our database. Now we need to read the database URL variable and then pass it to this URL property. And since this file is not a NestJS module, we cannot use the config service here. Instead, we're going to directly use the Env variable with process.env. But before doing that, make sure to import the .env/config. All right. Now we can use process.env and then use our database URL variable. Okay. Now we can use the Drizzle kit to create the migrations and push them to our Postgres database. So here, before doing that, let's go to the Neon console and here click on the tables. As you can see, we don't have any tables here. So let's get back to our NestJS project and open up our terminal. Let's clear this up first. And here I'm going to say npx drizzle kit and first run the generate command. It actually creates a Drizzle directory here in the root path of our application. And then inside it, as you can see, we have the migrations file. It creates a SQL script for creating the users table. All right, now let's get back to our terminal and let's push the migrations to our database. So here again, I'm going to use npx drizzle kit, and this time we're going to run the migrate command. Right, so let's run that. It complains about the URL is undefined. That's because we have a typo here. So let's fix that. Let's save this. And again, let's run the migrate command. As you can see it now running the migrations, and it's done. So let's get back to our Neon console and let's refresh the page. And as you can see, we have a users table here, and these are the fields of our table. All right, so in this way, we can create our tables with the Drizzle ORM. Now let's get back to our NestJS project and create the other tables in our database along with their relationship. So next we are going to create the profile info table, which has a one-to-one relationship with the users table. So every user can have one profile, and each profile only belongs to just one user. So that's why it is called one-to-one relationship. All right, back to the VS Code, and I go to the schema file and let's create the profile info table. So I'm going to say export Actually, let's close the terminal and say export const profile info. Again, set it to PG table, specify the name, just go ahead with the profile info. All right, then pass the config object. It has the ID inside it, say serial, specify the name, and it also is the primary key of the table. It has the metadata, which is a JSON. Just use the JSON B, which comes from the Drizzle ORM /PG core, and just put the name of the field, just call it metadata. All right, this field can have JSON data. Now we need to create the foreign key field, which actually references to the ID of the user. So here I'm going to say user ID, and we need to set its type the same as the ID field of the user table. Here we set its type to serial, which means that it is going to be an auto increment integer field. All right, we just set its type to integer and actually call the integer function, set a name for it, user ID, and then chain the references function. It takes a callback, and inside the callback, we need to return the field of the user table that this user ID referred to. So it is the users.id. Now this user ID is a foreign key which references to the ID of the users table. Now let's open up the terminal, and first let's run the generate command of the Drizzle kit, and after that just run the migrate command of Drizzle kit to push the migrations to our Postgres database. All right, let's get back to the Neon console and just refresh the page, and we don't have the profile info table. Let's get back to our VS Code, and that's because we didn't save the schema file. So now let's clear this up and generate the migrations, and then just run the migrate command. Now let's get back to Neon console and refresh the tables, and as you can see, now we have the profile info table, and these are the fields of the profile info. And here we have the user field, which is not actually a physical field. That's because we have set this user ID as a foreign key, which refers to the users table. All right, so let's get back to the VS Code, and here's the implicit way of defining the relationship between two tables in the Drizzle ORM. At the end of this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can define the relationships between two tables explicitly with the relations function of the Drizzle ORM, and also explain the difference between the implicit way and explicit way of defining relationships between tables. All right, now in the next section, I'm going to show you how you can have multiple schema file in Drizzle ORM. But before doing that, if you have watched up to this point of this video, please like this video because it helps me grow on YouTube, and I really need your help to grow on YouTube. And also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I have comprehensive courses on Node.js frameworks in my channel, so you can consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for supporting me and this channel. Alright, now let's back to our tutorial. Having multiple schema file in Drizzle ORM is really easy. I go to the Drizzle module, and I'm going to create a directory, and I'm going to call it schema. Actually, the name doesn't matter. You can name it whatever you want. And then inside it, we're going to create a new file again. Let's say we are going to create a schema for the user table. So I'm going to name this file users.schema.ts. All right. And here it's not mandatory to put the .schema inside the name of your schema file, but later you can see with these .schema in your schema file names, we can easily manage our schema file. So let's create this file, and I go back to the schema, and I just cut the user table from the main schema file and paste it inside the user.schema.ts file, and then import the missing import. We need to import them from the Drizzle ORM PG score. All right, that's it. And now let's create another schema file for the profile info. So here in the schema directory, we're going to create a new file. I'm going to call it profile info.schema.ts. All right, now let's get back to the schema file and just cut the profile info and paste it inside the profile info.schema file. All right, and then here in the foreign key of the profile info, where we return the users.id, we need to import the users table from the users.schema file. Now I just moved the schema file to the schema directory, and here in the schema directory, I'm going to say export everything from the import file info.schema, and also let's copy that and let's say import everything from the users.schema file. All right, now I get back to the Drizzle module where we import our schema. Make sure that you import everything from the schema file that is inside the schema directory, this file. All right, so when we move the schema file to the schema directory, the VS Code fixed the import path for us. Let's save this, and now let's get back to the drizzle config.ts file in the root path of our application. And here we need to use regular expression for specifying the schema files. We're going to say that it is on the src directory and then drizzle directory, and then on the schema directory, that schema directory here. And then inside that schema directory, import everything that ends with that schema.ts. All right, so that's why we add the .schema in the name of our schema files. All right, that's it. And now let's add another schema file for the user post here. So it has ID, author ID, which refers to the user table, title, and content. And here, as you can see, we have a many-to-one relationship from the users table to the post table. Each user can have multiple posts, but each post only belongs to just one user. That's why we call it one-to-many relationship from the user to post table. We can also call it many-to-one relationship from the post table to the users table. It's the same. So let's get back to VS Code and create another schema file for the post table. So here inside the schema directory, I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call it posts.schema.ts. All right. And then here, just quickly create the table, export posts, and set it to PG table. Specify the name of the table inside our database posts, and then pass the field objects. We have the ID. It is going to be a serial. Make sure that you import these types functions from the PG score, not the MySQL. All right. Now define a name, just has ID, and we're going to set it to primary key. And we forgot to use the const here. That's why we have the error. Let's fix that. Now let's create the other field. It is the title, say text, and let's change the not now function. The same way, you can just copy the previous line and change it to content. And now we can create our primary key to the users table. It's author ID, which refers to the user that actually write this post. It's a integer because we set the users table ID to serial. So we need to set it to integer. Just put the name of the field and call the references, and then pass the callback here. We're going to return users.id. Right, let's save this and let's open up our terminal to do a migrations to see if our multiple schemas file are working. So here I'm going to say npx drizzle kit and generate. All right, now let's run the migrate command. It's running here. Okay, now we can go to the Neon console, but here let's try Drizzle ORM Studio. So here let's clear this up first, and I'm going to say npx drizzle kit studio. Open it up, and as you can see here, we have the post table here. If I open that, you can see we have the ID of the user, title, content, author ID, and also the user field, which is not actually a physical field because we have created an author ID foreign key, which refers to the users table, and that's why we have the user field. All right, now let's quickly create the other tables so we can go to this section about creating the relationships explicitly with the relations function. So I close this off and I go back to the diagram here. Now let's quickly create the comments table. It has two relationships here. The first one is a one-to-many relationship with the users table. Each user can have multiple comments, but each comment only belongs to one user. And in the same way, each post can have multiple comments, but each comment only belongs to one post. So we have also a one-to-many relationship from the post table to the comments table. So let's quickly create the comments table, get back to the VS Code, and let's create a file for the comments inside the schema directory, comments.schema.ts. Now let's go to the post and just copy the table here, get back to the comments, paste it here. Let's rename it to the comments and change the name of the table. Here in the first argument, it should have an ID, also a text, and let's change it here. All right. We don't want the content. It has an author ID, which is a foreign key to the users table. Also, we're going to create another foreign key. It should have a post ID, which refers to the ID inside the post table. So here in the references callback, we're going to return the posts.id. Okay, now we have the comments table. Let's get back to our diagram. And here, as you can see, we have a many-to-many relationship between the users table and groups table. So what is this users to group table? In relational databases like Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, and so on, for creating a many-to-many relationship, we need to create a join table which sits between our two mains table. In this case, this users to group table sits between the users table and groups table. And then we have a one-to-many relationship from both table to the join table. So as you can see here, we have a one-to-many relationship to the users to groups table, and also we have the same relationship from the groups to user to groups. So now each user can subscribe to multiple groups, and each group can have multiple users. That's why we call it many-to-many relationship. And as I said, we need to create a join table which has many-to-one relationship from the join table to our base tables. All right. So first, let's quickly create the groups table, and then we're going to create the join table. Let's get back to the VS Code, and then let's create another schema file for groups. So here I'm going to name it groups.schema.ts file. And then inside it, let's just copy the post table here and get back to the groups schema, paste it here, change the name to groups, and also change it from here. It just has an ID and the name. So let's get back to VS Code, rename this to name, and change it also here. So we don't need these two fields. And now let's create the join table here inside the groups table, or we can just create another file. So I just prefer to put it here inside the group schema. So let's just copy that and paste it here, and let's rename it to users to groups. And also let's change the name of the table here, and it should has a user ID and also a group ID. All right. So the first one is going to be a user ID, which actually is a foreign key to the users table. So we need to change the type function to integer, and don't want it to be primary key. Just want it to be a foreign key. Pass the callback and just refer to the users.id. All right. In the same way, we need to have a group ID, which refers to the groups.id. Let's rename the field's name inside our type functions. All right. And put a comma here. Now our error is gone. And now let's put a comment here. This is the join table. All right. Now, as you can see, this table doesn't have a primary key. We can create a serial ID field for this table, but the better solution is to create a composite primary key, which actually is a combination of the user ID and group ID. So as you know, primary key must be unique. But here, if we set the primary key to user ID, it does not satisfy the uniqueness constraint, because we can have the same users that subscribe to multiple groups. So in the user ID field, we might have a duplicated user ID. The same idea goes for the group ID. One group can have multiple users, so we might have a duplicated group ID. But the combination of these two fields is unique. So we can consider the composition of these two fields as the primary key. In order to define a composite primary key, after the fields object, we can pass a callback function. So it takes the table, which refers to this table, and we need to return an object from this function. Here inside it, we're going to specify a property named pk, and then set it to primary key function that comes from the PG core, and make sure that you're not using the primary key function with the capital P in the first letter. All right. So here we're going to pass a config object to the primary key, and then we can specify the columns, which is a list, and it should be the table dot group ID and user ID. We have the error. That's because we need to put the comma here after the field object. And now, as you can see, we can have access to the group ID and also the table.user ID. So as I said, this table parameter here refers to this table user groups ID. So in this way, we can have a composite primary key. All right, so before moving to the next section, let me take a look at the checklist of this video. We're almost done with integrating the Drizzle ORM in our NestJS project, but there's still a little thing that we need to do in order to complete this section. So I just put a line before it. We're going to do that later in this video. We're done with creating the table, so I just crossed it out. Also with migrations, we're not completely done with relationships. We still need to define our relationships with relation function if we want the full functionality of the query API of Drizzle ORM. So we're going to do that later in this video. We're done with composite primary key, so just cross it out. So now in the next section, we are going to define indexes for our tables with Drizzle ORM. So now let's just go back to VS Code and do that. So back to our VS Code, here we are in the user to groups table. Let's say we are going to define an index on user ID field. So inside the callback where we define the composite key, we can define our indexes. So here we just need to put a name for it. I'm going to call it user ID index. And then we're going to use the index function, which comes from the PG core. And then we need to put the name for it, which will be the name of the index inside our database. So here, I'll just go ahead with the same name, user ID index. And then we're going to change the on function and specify the field that we are going to put the index. So here, as you can see, we have a parameter on a callback, which refers to the user to groups table. So here we can use the table.user ID. And that's it. In this way, we can easily define an index for our user ID field in this table. Just pass the callback after the fields object and then define the index with the index function. So now let's create the migration, npx drizzle kit, and then generate. And then I go to the Drizzle directory in the root path of our application where we have the migrations, and you should not confuse it with the Drizzle directory inside the src directory. You can name this Drizzle to something like Drizzle DB or just DB module. Now let me open the last migration here. As you can see, it creates a SQL script for creating a index with the name user ID index on table user groups using B-tree structure on field user ID. So now let's push this migration. So let's clear this up first. And I'm going to say npx drizzle kit and then migrate. And as you can see, it works without any error. And now we have an index on the field user ID of the user to groups table. So yeah, that's it for creating indexes for any fields of our table. Now let's get back to our video checklist. And here I just cross out the indexes. And now in the next section, we are going to implement seeding process in our NestJS application. All right, get back to VS Code. And here inside the Drizzle module, I'm going to create a new file called seed.ts. All right, now in this file, we are going to implement the seeding process. And we're going to run this file independently from the NestJS project directly from our terminal. So actually, this file is independent from our NestJS modules. So we cannot use the Drizzle provider that we export from the Drizzle module. We need to create a new instance of our Drizzle DB and then use that instance for inserting some testing data or fake data into our database so we can test our application with those testing data. All right, so in the first place, in this seed.ts file, we need to create an instance of Drizzle ORM. So for doing that, I'm going to just go back to the Drizzle module and just copy this code for creating a new instance of Drizzle DB, get back to the seed.ts file, and here I just paste it. And now we need to import the missing imports. So I import the pool from PG, and here we don't want to return it. Instead, we are going to keep the Drizzle DB instance inside the constant named DB. And let's just import the Drizzle here from Drizzle ORM /node Postgres. And then we need to import the schema. So here I'm going to say import everything as schema from the schema directory and then schema file. All right. Now we need to import this type from Drizzle ORM /node Postgres. And here we need to read the database URL from our env file. So as I said before, this file is out of the scope of our NestJS module. So we cannot use the config service, just like the Drizzle module, to read the database URL from our env file. We need to read it directly from the process.env. So here we're going to say process.env.database URL. But this will not work. It just return undefined. In order to make it work, we need to import the .env/config. So here I'm going to say import .env/config. Now this statement will return the database URL inside the env file, this variable. All right. So let's get back to the seed.ts file, and again make sure that you're importing the .env/config. Otherwise, this expression will return undefined for you. Okay. Now we need to write a main function in which we are going to actually insert some data with Drizzle ORM into our Postgres database. So here I want to say async function. I'm going to call it main, and it doesn't have any parameters. So inside this function, as I said, we're going to insert some data with Drizzle ORM DB instance into our Postgres database. As a first step, let me insert 50 users into our database. I'm going to do that with promise.all. So here I'm going to say await promise.all, and then we need to create 50 promises for inserting 50 users in our database. And we're going to use the promise.all because we are going to resolve these 50 promises simultaneously. All right. So here we're going to create a dummy array with 50 elements and then fill it with, I don't know, just empty string. It doesn't matter what is the elements of these 50 members array. And then we're going to map through the members. And for each member, we're going to create an async callback. And then we're going to create a promise for inserting the user into our database. All right. So here we're going to say const user and set it to await DB, which is the Drizzle DB instance that we created here, and then call the insert function. We need to specify the tables that we are going to insert into. It is going to be users, so it comes from the schema.users, and then we're going to change the values function, and in this function we can pass a list to insert a list of users into the users table, or we can just put one user object here to be inserted in the users table. So in the values, we're going to initialize the properties of the user, and for initializing the properties of our entities, we're going to use a package called Faker. This package is used for creating the fake data. All right. So in order to install that, I'm going to open up the terminal, and here I'm going to say npm I at faker-js/faker. All right. It is installed, and now we can use it here. Just say faker, and as you can see, it comes from the at faker.js/faker. So let's get back here, and here I'm going to use faker.internet.email. This function will create a fake random email for us. Now we need to specify the name. Again, I'm going to call the faker.person.firstname and a empty space, and then again faker.person.lastname. And also we need to set the password. I just put it as an empty string. Since we don't want to integrate the authentication in this video, I just put it as empty string. In real world application, you need to hash your passwords with some libraries like Bcrypt or Argon2, and then save the hashed version of the password into your database. All right. Now, after this function, we're going to change the returning function, which actually returns the inserted users from our database. And then we're going to return that user from the callback. So here I'm going to say return user, and it's a list. We're going to return the first user, and then actually we're going to return the ID of the first inserted user. So each of these 50 promises will insert a new user into our database and returns the generated ID of the user, which actually created by the database. So the returning list of the promise.all will have all the 50 user IDs. So we can keep it inside a list here. I'm going to say const user IDs and set it to the returning list of the promise.all function. All right, now in the same way, we're going to insert 50 posts into our post table. So I just copy this section here and paste it here. We just rename the user IDs to post IDs, and then here we're gonna have a post, and then we're gonna insert data to the schema.post. So as you can see, we don't have the post from our schema, and that's because we didn't export the post from the schema here. So just copy that and export everything from the posts.schema. Also export everything from the groups.schema, and also export everything from the comments.schema. Let's save this, and now we can access to the schema.posts here. And in the values object, we're going to initialize the property of each post. So here I'm going to say content and set it to faker.lorem.paragraph. It just create a random paragraph, and then we're going to specify the title in the same way and set it to faker.lorem.sentence. Right? We're going to set the value of the author ID, which is actually the user ID of the user that write these posts. So here we're going to choose randomly one of the user IDs list here. So here again, we're going to use the faker object that helpers that RI element, and then we're going to pass the user IDs. So it actually randomly choose one of the user IDs here and set it to author ID. And then we just need to return the ID of the posts. All right, now let's just insert some comments into our database. So again, just copy that, and here we're going to paste it. Actually, we don't need to keep the comments ID because we don't want to use the comments ID in any of our tables. So just call the promise.all function. We're going to create 50 promises here, and let's rename each promise to comment, and we're going to insert it to schema.comments. And let's just remove this one. For the title, let's rename it to text. We're going to have the author ID. So we're going to choose one of the user IDs randomly and set the author ID of the comment. And we need to set the post ID, which actually determines the post that this comment belongs to. So here we're going to use this statement again and pass the post ID. So we're going to randomly choose one of the post IDs and set it to this post ID of the comment. Now we just return the ID of the comment. Actually, this is not required, but let me just return it from this promise.all function. Now after that, we are going to insert two groups in our group table, just JS and TS. So we don't want to use the promise.all. Instead, we're going to say const inserted groups and set it to await db.insert, specify the table, which is groups, and change the values function and set a list here. So we're just going to insert the both groups in one values function. So inside it, we're going to pass the first groups object. We need to set the name property, and for the first one, we just put the JS, and for the second, we're going to put TS. All right, and then we need to call the returning function to return the inserted groups and save them within the inserted groups list here. Now we need to get the groups ID. So here I'm going to say const group IDs, and then set it to inserted groups.map, take each group and just return group.id. So the groups ID will be a list of group IDs. All right, now we need to insert some records to the user to groups table. It's actually a join table which implements the many-to-many relationships between the users and group. So we are going to loop through the all 50 users that we have just inserted in the user table and put their user ID here. And for the group ID, we're going to choose randomly one of the IDs of the groups table. So let's get back to VS Code here and again use promise.all, and then we don't want to create a dummy array here. We have the user IDs, so we're going to map through the user IDs, and for each one pass an async callback. We're going to take the user ID, and then we're going to return await db.insert to users to groups, and then change the values function and pass the user ID that we have in the parameter, and then randomly choose one of the groups ID here. All right, so I'm going to say group ID and set it to faker.helpers.array elements and pass the group IDs here. And lastly, we need to call the returning function. All right, this is the main function, and now we need to just call it here. So here I'm going to say main, and since it's an async function, we're going to call the then function, and after that we're going to call the catch and take the error, and if there is an error, we're going to console that error. So here I'm going to use console.error and pass the error object. And then we need to end this process. So let's put it inside a block, and after logging the error, we're going to use process.exit and pass the 0 here. Let's save this, and now we need to go to the package.json file, and inside the scripts object here, we're going to create a new script. So here I'm going to call it db:/seed. We're going to run the seed file with TS node, which is actually for running the TypeScript file, and we need to put the path of the seed file. So it's inside the src directory, and then Drizzle, and then its name is seed.ts. All right, now let's open up the terminal, and before running this script, let me quickly run a migration. All right, let's run the migrate function. Now let's save the seed file, and let's run the script for running the seed file, npm run db:/seed. All right, it's done, and now let's run the Drizzle Studio, npx drizzle hit studio. And as you can see, we have the data inside all tables except the profile info. And that's because we forgot to insert some data into the profile info. You can insert some testing data in the same way that we have inserted into the other tables. And yeah, that's it for implementing the seeding process of our database with Drizzle ORM. All right, so now let's get back to our checklist. Let's cross out the seeding. Now we are going to do CRUD operations. All right, get back to VS Code, open up the terminal, and here let's create a module with its controller and services for doing CRUD operation for one of these schemas here. For example, let's create a module for post table. So here I'm going to say NestJS, and I'm going to call it post. We don't want to create the test file, so I put --nospec. Then we're going to go ahead with the REST API, and we want to generate the CRUD entry points. Right now, as you can see, we have a post module, and inside it we have the entities. We don't want the entities, so I just remove that. We have the DTO create post and update post, and also we have the controller. As you can see, it has all the CRUD endpoints for the post entity, and here as you can see, we have corresponding service functions inside the post service class. Now we are going to inject the Drizzle provider and use the Drizzle API for doing these CRUD operations. So here in the constructor, I'm going to use @inject, and then we need to put the Drizzle symbol that we have created inside the Drizzle module. So as you can see, it contains the token of the Drizzle provider. So we need to put it in the @inject decorator Drizzle, and then we can just have the Drizzle DBs. So I'm going to say private DB, and we need to set its type to this type here. So instead of using this type in every services that we want to use Drizzle ORM and also import this schema from this path, let's copy this type here, and inside the Drizzle module, we're going to create a directory, and I'm going to call it types, and inside it, we're going to create drizzle.d.ts. All right. Now inside it, we just want to export a type. I'm going to call it Drizzle DB, and we're going to set it to Node PG database, and we just need to import the schema here. So I'm going to say import everything as schema from the parent directory, and then schema, and then schema file. All right. We also need to import the Node PG database from the Drizzle ORM /Node Postgres. Let's save this, and now inside the post service, we can set its type to Drizzle DB type that we have just created, and then put the body of the constructor. Now we can use the Drizzle provider. So here inside the find all function, let's first mark it with async, and then inside it we can return await this.db.select, and then from posts. And since we have used the Drizzle module here, we need to register it inside the post module. So in the import section, we're going to just use the Drizzle module. All right, let's save this and open up the terminal. Let's run the server. And we have an error here. That's because we need to register the config module. So I go to the app module, and here inside the import section, we're going to use config module dot for root, and then pass a config object and set is global to true. Make sure to register the config module here in the app module, your root module. Otherwise, you've got a runtime error. So NestJS application is started. And now let's go to Insomnia to test the post API. So here, as you can see, we have a find all get request, which actually send a post request to the local host 3000 and then /post. So if I send the request, it will call the find all function of the post service. And as you can see, we have the post inside the response. So now let's get back to our checklist. Now we have successfully integrated the Drizzle ORM in NestJS, and all we need to do is complete the CRUD operations and use the relation function for defining the relationships between the tables. So now let's get back to VS Code and go back to our post service. Now here, instead of this, let's use the query API. So here I'm going to say return await this.db.query. And as you can see, we have all the tables. I choose the post and use find many. And if I save this and get back to Insomnia, run the request again, you can see we have the same result. So you can choose between the select function or query API. The query API is more intuitive, and actually if you have some experience with Prisma, you may feel more comfortable with the query API. So let's get back to VS Code again, and now let's say we want the post with all its comments. All right, we want to retrieve the post with its author ID. So here we're going to pass a config object, and here we have the with API, and inside it, if I hit the control space to open up the autocomplete, you can see we don't have autocomplete for the other tables that have a relationship with the post table, like users table. So in order to use the with API here, we need to define our relationships between the tables with the relation function of the Drizzle ORM. In the next section, we're going to do that. So let's go to the post schema, and here we're going to use the relations function to define the relationships. So I'm going to say export const post relations and set it to relations function, which comes from the Drizzle ORM. And in the first parameter, we need to specify the table, which is posts. And in the second parameter, we need to pass a callback. And if I get back here, we can have an object in the parameters of this callback. It offers many and one. So now let's quickly get back to our diagram. Here, as you can see, the post table has a many-to-one relationship with the users table and one-to-many relationship with the comments table. So consider this relation a many-to-one relationship to user. Take the other side of the relationship, which is user, it's a one. So we need to use one function to specify the user and consider this relationship. Take the other side of the relationship, which is a many. We need to use function many to define this relation. So always consider the other side of the relationship. So now let's implement this relation. As I said, we considered the other side of relationship, which is one. So we need to use function one. Get back to VS Code and here extract the one function. And here in the callback, we need to return object. And inside the object, we're going to say that post table has an author. Actually, the name of the author is up to you. You can call it user, but the author is more intuitive. And actually, we are saying that this post table has one author, which is actually inside the users table. So we're going to use one function that we've got from here and then specify the other side of relationship, which is the users table. Okay. And then we need to pass a config object. Inside it, we're going to specify the field object. And here we're going to say that the posts.author ID will actually reference us to the users.id. All right. So in this way, we have implemented this relation. Let me change the color here. Now let's define these relationship. So we consider the other side of the relationship, which is many. So we need to use function many to define this relationship. Get back to VS Code, and here we're going to extract the many function, and then we're going to say that each post has many comments. So I use comments here. We're going to use the many function, pass the comments table, all right? And we don't need to pass the config object with many functions. So we're actually saying that each record of post table has many comments. We have implemented just these relationships. All right, so now let's save this and get back to the post service. And here, if I open up the autocomplete, you can see we have the author and comments. So now we can retrieve the post with its author. We can set the author to true. And if I get back to Insomnia and send the request again, you can see now we have the author object for each post. So when we define our relationships with relations function, we can use the with API of the query API to perform nested queries. So now let's do a complicated nested queries. Let's say we want to retrieve each post with also its author, and each author here needs to contain its group object inside it. So in the first place, we need to define the relations of the users table and then define the relations of the user to group. So let's get back to our diagram, and here first we need to define this relation and then we need to define this relation. So after that we can run a nested query that contains actually 4 tables. All right, so get back to VS Code. Let's first define relations of the users table. Let's get back to the VS Code and go to the users table. So first let me go to the post table and copy this relations and go to the users relations. Here let me paste the relations here. So first we need to rename it to users relations and then specify the users table here, and let's just remove these relations. Let's get back to diagram. So it has 4 relations, one to the comments, one to the post, profile info, and also the users to groups. So first let me define this relation. The other side of the relation is many, so we need to use many function to define this relation. Get back to VS Code, and here we're going to say comments, and we're going to use many and just pass the comments table. All right, get back to diagram. Let's define this relation. The other side is many. Again, we need to use many function. Actually, we are saying that each user has many posts. So again, use many and pass the post table. Get back to diagram, and this time let's implement this relation. The other side of the relation is 1. So we need to use a 1 to define this relation. So each user has 1 profile info. So you can have just profile and set it to 1 function, pass the profile info, and actually we don't need to pass the config object to define the fields and references, because if I get back to diagram, you can see the foreign key is inside the profile info. So we don't need to specify it inside the users relation, and therefore we don't need to specify the fields and references with 1 function. All right, let's get back to diagram, and now let's implement this relation. The other side is many, so get back to VS Code and I'm going to say users to groups and pass the many function and just put the users to groups table. All right, now if I get back to the post service, let's recite the criteria. We want to retrieve all posts, that each post needs to have its author and each author needs to have its group. So we're going to put the with here and specify users to groups, and then for the groups again use the with, because it's a many-to-many function. We need to access to the groups through the join table. So inside the join table again we're going to use the with, and here as you can see we don't have the autocomplete with the groups, so we need to define the relations of the users group. So let's get back to the users to group table. It's inside the group schema.ts, and here I'm going to say export users to groups relations and set it to relations function of the Drizzle ORM, pass the users to groups table, and then pass the callback. This callback will return an object. All right, now we can extract the 1 function, because if I get back here, if we actually consider this table, let me remove these lines. All right, so we need to define this relation and also this relation. Okay, so as you can see, the other side of this relation is 1, and also with this one, the other side is 1. So with both of these 2 relations, we can define them with 1 function. Get back to VS Code and just extract the 1 function. We're going to have user and then pass the 1, right? So here, let me just put a const here. I forgot to do that. Okay. Now on the 1 function, the other side of the relation is users table. Then we need to pass the config object. We're going to specify the fields, and then here we're going to say user to groups that user ID will reference to the users table that ID. Let's just copy this relation and let's define the other relation. It's to the groups table. So here we're going to specify the groups, and we're going to say user to groups that group ID will references to the groups table that ID. Let's save this. Now if I get back to the post table, and here inside the user to groups object and in the with object, if I hit the control space, you can see we can access to the group here, and I just set it to true. Now if I get back to Insomnia and send the request, you can see we have the post, the author, and then the user groups, and then here at the last level we have the group of the author, and we have the same structure with other posts. All right, so this is a complex nested query that we can do with this many-to-many relation. So you can define all other relations here with the relations function. I just define all the relationships and put them in the GitHub repo. You can access them if you want, but we're not going to define all of these relations in this video because this makes this video really long. And if you use the GitHub repo of this project, please follow me on GitHub and also give a star to this GitHub repo. Thanks for your support. And now let's make this query even more complicated. Let's say we want the post that its ID is equal to, for example, 20 with all its nested entities. So let's get back to VS Code, and here before the with object we can specify the where, and it's a callback, takes the post, and the second parameter contains filter functions, and it should return the returning value of the filter function. So here in this case we're going to use eq, stands for equals, and then we're going to use this eq and we're going to say posts.id and then pass 20, which means that find the post that its ID equals to 20. So let's get back to Insomnia and send the request. You can see we have the post with the ID 20. All right, so that's it for the query API. And now let me quickly show you the update API. So here, let's say we want to update the specific post with this ID. So we're going to return await this.db.update, and then here inside it, we need to specify the table that we are going to update, its posts, and then change the set function. Inside it, we're going to specify the values that we are going to update. For example, we're going to set the title to something like AAA, I don't know, and then we can change the where function and use the EQ function, which comes from the Drizzle ORM, and pass the post.id and then put the ID parameter here. All right, let's save this. And if I go to the controller, which calls this function, it's a patch request. So let's get back here, change the method to patch and put the ID, which is 20. As you can see, the title is this. And if I send the request, you can see the row counts is 1, which means that one row has been affected by this query. So let's change the method to get and remove the ID here. It returns the post with the ID 20. Send the request. You can see the title of the post 20 is changed to AAA. All right. In the same way, we can delete a post. So inside the post service, in the remove function, first we need to mark it with async and await this.db.delete, put the name of the table, then change the where, use the EQ function, specify the post.id and pass the ID parameter. So it's remove all the posts which their ID equals to the ID parameter. So let's get back to the controller. It's a delete request. So here we need to change the method to delete. And here let's specify the ID 20. If I send the request, as you can see, we have one row affected with this delete function. Get back here and change the method, and it returns the post with the ID 20. If I send the request, we should get back an empty list. As you can see, we have an empty list, and this means that we have removed the post with the ID 20. So let's get back to our checklist. And as you can see, we have completed the CRUD operation section, and also we have defined the relations with the relations function. So yeah, that's it for this video. And if you want to know how you can revoke your JWT tokens or invalidate your tokens, you can click here, and I'll see you over there. Have a nice time. Bye-bye.